I'm Adam Doughton, and this is the first revision session for A-level history. These 4 sessions will focus on Unit 3, specifically the American century from 1890 to 1990. So I'll be leading the first 2 sessions, which will look at American foreign policy. So my first session will look at changing continuity in US foreign policy between 1890 to 1941. Then my next week's session will focus on the impact of US involvement in the Second World War and the Cold War between 1941 and 1975. And then in sessions 3 and 4, Mr. Morell will look at civil rights, which is the other theme on this unit. Then we'll do a live session with both myself and Mr. Morell, and we will recap any key information and go through any questions you have. So Unit 3 will always have 2 essay questions. You'll have a short essay you need to answer and a 100-year period you'd have to cover as well. Section A will always have a choice. So that choice will be on 2 small questions. Okay, and it will be on one of the themes of the course. So for example, if section A is on foreign policy, section B then would have to be on civil rights. Or if section A was on civil rights, section B would be on foreign policy. Okay. Now, these are the 2 themes that we're covering in the American century. However, the other units in Unit 3 will also have 2 themes, and the exam paper will be exactly the same. 2 questions in section A for the one theme, and 1 question in section B for the other theme. Now, the first topic I'm going to cover today is changing continuity in US foreign policy from 1890 to 1941. Okay, and the content we need to cover is American imperialism in the late 19th century, the Spanish-American War and the Panama Canal, the problem of neutrality and entry into the First World War, how America contributed to victory in the First World War, the peace treaties that came after the First World War, and then isolationism in the 1920s and 1930s, which will lead us up to then the Second World War, which I will cover in the next session. Now, type of questions they could ask on this topic area. I've given some examples there. They'll always start with something like, how far do you agree? To what extent? How significant? Or they give you a statement and ask you to discuss it. Now, even though this won't cover all of them, you can assume that if there's a question in 1890 to 1941, it's very likely that they would either ask about isolationism, imperialism, or they could choose an important event like the First World War and ask about the impact of that. Okay, so you'll see there my first one, it asks, to what extent was American foreign policy mainly influenced by imperialism? The second one asks, to what extent did American governments pursue a consistent approach to foreign policy? How far do you agree that US foreign policy was mainly isolationist in this time period? And then the influence of the First World War. Before I go through the key content for this topic area, it's important to recap what is expected of you in the essay questions. Whether it's an essay for Unit 1, Unit 3, Unit 4, they would expect the same things. Okay, so I've given an example there of how far do you agree that US foreign policy was mainly isolationist in the period from 1918 to 1941. You need to make sure you remain fully focused on the key concept. So the key concept there is mainly isolationist. Okay, your whole essay should revolve around that key concept. Okay, you need to make sure you cover the time period. And this time period is 1918 to 1941. You don't have to have something for every year, but you would be expected to cover most of that without large gaps. You need to make sure that any of your arguments are supported with detailed historical knowledge to make sure you move from assertion to argument. And most importantly, you need to analyze and evaluate that key concept. Okay? It's not just a for and against response like GCSE. You need to rip it apart, that concept. You need to think about arguments in support of it, arguments against it. Okay, every paragraph should have evaluation and consider a range of perspectives. It's important that you end by reaching a supported judgment on that exact question. Now, before I go on to American imperialism in the 1890s, just going to cover a bit of background knowledge. So before 1890, on the whole, America aimed to stay isolationist. They're very inward looking. They did follow a foreign policy of the Monroe Doctrine from 1823, which said that they would avoid European affairs unless they interfered with the Americas. So any attempts to colonize the Americas by Europe would be seen as unfriendly, and America could get involved. They also believed in manifest destiny. This belief that it was their destiny, the white settlers, to take the whole of the North of America. Okay. So the first key concept we need to know for the foreign policy part of this course is imperialism. So imperialism is the control of one country by another, usually by military and political occupation, but you'll see with US as an example, it can often be economic control as well. Okay. Now, there were disagreements on whether or not America should become more imperialist in terms of government and also public opinion. Okay. Now, some of these arguments in support of imperialism was the idea of social Darwinism. People felt like it was the duty of America to spread its civilization. There were also arguments in support of imperialism because of economic motives. They wanted more markets abroad. But also this idea of preclusive imperialism. They wanted to prevent other countries colonizing the Americas. Now, I've got a range of arguments on this page now, some in support of imperialism and some arguments against it. Now, I'm going to give you a minute to read through each and decide which ones are arguments for imperialism and which ones are arguments against it. Right, so could lead to further entanglements like war, would be an argument against imperialism. To compete with other countries that were expanding their empire, that would be an argument for imperialism. Overseas possessions would provide American manufacturers with cheap raw materials. That would be an argument for imperialism. Preclusive imperialism, to take colonies to prevent other countries doing so. That would be an argument for imperialism. The duty of America to spread its civilization would be an argument for imperialism. Again, manifest destiny, which we've already looked at, would it be an argument for imperialism? Some use the argument that the US didn't treat its own minorities well, so it was unlikely they were doing it for good reasons, which would be an argument against imperialism. Also, America was once a colony which fought for its freedom. That would be an argument against imperialism. Despite these disagreements on whether or not America should become more imperialist, there's some clear arguments that they were more imperialist in the 1890s. So in Samoa, there was a civil war, and Britain and Germany both had interest in this territory, so America did get involved there. They ended the civil war with a tripartite convention, which allowed America to establish a protectorate over Eastern Samoa. Okay, so they shared it with Germany. Now, that is a clear example of imperialism. In 1898, they annexed Hawaii because it was an important location. It's in the Pacific and it's good for trade with Asia. So that is an example of imperialism. They purchased the Philippines from Spain. Okay, and we'll have a look at the Spanish-American War in a second. Puerto Rico would be administered by the US. Now, that is an example of imperialism. They also got involved when there was border disputes between Britain and Venezuela. They threatened military intervention, and the Britain did back down. So these are examples then of America becoming more outward looking, but obviously each of these are in the Americas. Okay, so they are sticking to the Monroe Doctrine only when they feel like their interests are threatened in the Americas. Now, in 1898, they get involved in Cuba. This leads to the Spanish-American War. So Cuba was a Spanish colony, and they had been fighting for their independence for a number of years. Okay, there was rebellions between 1868 and 1878, and America, especially public opinion, politicians, newspapers, were all in support of Cuba gaining their independence. Now, in February 1898, an American battleship, the USS Maine, blew up in Havana Harbor. Now, they've looked into it, and it's unlikely that this was actually a Spanish attack. However, the newspaper, whipped up hysteria, and they used it as a reason to get involved. Now, when Spain refused to give Cuba independence, McKinley asked Congress to declare war. Now, they do agree to declare war. However, Congress also added the Teller Amendment to this declaration of war. That put conditions on it. And the conditions were that Cuba would get their independence once America defeated Spain. Now, America won this war very easily, but rather than the strength of the US, it was more down to the weakness of the Spanish. It only lasted 4 months. The peace treaty at the end actually gave America control of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. So that is clearly imperialist. Even if they've got in there for good reasons, some moral reasons, it is still imperialist by what they've gained from it. Another example then, they wanted to have control of an area of Panama in order to build a canal. Now, this had been an idea that they had for a while. It'd make trade between East and Western states a lot easier. Now, when the people of Panama staged a revolt against Colombia, America supported them, knowing that this would allow them to have that territory. So once Panama achieved independence, they accepted a US offer of $10 million for that strip of land, where they then built the canal. It wasn't completed until 1914. But this was crucial in terms of trade. Now, you can notice a lot of what America do in terms of imperialism or actions in this early part of the course is influenced by economic motives. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to answer these questions on the important parts of what we've just covered. If 3 minutes is enough, pause the video, but I'll go through the answers after that 3 minutes. So the first question then, what is the Monroe Doctrine? So the Monroe Doctrine is the policy that they followed from 1823, which said that any attempt by Europe to colonize parts of the Americas would be seen as unfriendly acts, and the US would get involved. Imperialism is this political or military control over other countries, so expanding your territory. It can also be economic. What is preclusive imperialism? Imperialism to stop other countries taking control of areas. So basically getting there first. Which important location was annexed in 1898? Hawaii. Under the Organic Act of 1900, which island would be administered by the US? That's Puerto Rico. The US stepped in when Venezuela had a border dispute with which country? Great Britain. How long did the Spanish-American War last? 4 months. Which territories were given to the US after the Spanish-American War? So you've got the Philippines, you've got Guam. How much money did Panama accept from US for the rights to the Panama Canal? They accepted $10 million. Okay, so if you're unsure about any of these, just rewind it and have a look through. But that's the important information you should know for the first few topics on the specification. So the next one then is the problem of neutrality and entry into the First World War. Now, even though World War I broke out in 1914, America didn't join until April 1917. So they did try to stay neutral for a number of years. Okay, and the reason was public opinion in America was against entry into the First World War. And also, President Wilson wanted to stay neutral. His aim was to stay out of it and then get involved when they were punishing the losing countries. Okay, so they could attempt to be involved in the peace treaty and make sure they'd avoid another war. Okay, now neutrality was very difficult because America did trade a lot more with Britain and France than they did with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Okay, this would cause tension. There was also pro-British feeling in America and anti-German feeling. Like the sensationalist news in the Spanish-American War about how the Spanish were treating the Cubans, that happened with the ideas of German atrocities as well. There was also unrestricted submarine warfare from February to August 1915. Now that led to the attacks on American ships, which caused tension. Now they did stop in August 1915 for a long period of time until we look at when they resumed that. Now, America ends up joining in 1917. Germany were making it quite difficult for America to stay out of it and not lose face because they resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. And it was starting to look like America had to retaliate. Also, there were suspicions of German activities within the US. Now, the extent of that is unknown. However, people were concerned about that. There was also the Zimmermann telegram sent from Germany to Mexico, asking Mexico to attack America and saying that if they did, and when Germany won, then they would give Mexico territories in the southern states of America. Now that telegram went through Britain first, so the message was passed to America. Now that led to the declaration of war and America becoming part of World War I. Now, they were crucial in the defeat of the Germans in 1918. Okay, it was starting to look like the Allies were going to lose this war. However, America breathed new life into this war, especially for Britain and France. So America's powerful navy joined the Royal Navy. German submarine campaign was defeated with the introduction of convoys, and American shipyards replaced most of the shipping lost at a very quick, impressive rate. America built their army quickly, and by March 1918, there were over 300,000 US troops in France. By November 1918, there were 2 million. So in the last major German attacks on the Western Front, American troops played a vital role. Okay, after Russia dropped out, it was basically a race to Paris, with the Americans trying to arrive in Europe and the Germans coming from the Russian front back to France. Okay, so America were crucial in this war, not just manpower, but also economically as well. You can see from the rate they produce in ships. Now, even though they were in it for a short period of time, they still suffered 109,000 casualties, which is a high number considering how long they're in there. And this leads to this isolationist feeling in America then. Now, after the war, the United States, well, specifically Wilson, felt like he should have a lot of say on what happened to Germany and Austria-Hungary and Europe. Now, France and Britain disagreed with that because they didn't put in as much time as those countries had. But Wilson outlined his 14 points. Now, these 14 points, the aim was that they would avoid another war. So they'd find whatever caused World War I and then prevent it through these 14 points. Now, he wanted independence for certain countries. He wanted disarmament, freedom of the seas, and an establishment of a League of Nations. Between these three countries, they couldn't agree on everything. He had to give in, he had to compromise, but he did manage to get the League of Nations in. But despite this, America never actually joined. The Senate voted against it. They felt like this would just keep getting them dragged into more and more conflict. Now, and again, for this important part, I'm going to give you another 2 minutes to answer these questions on American involvement in World War I and the peace treaties. Right, so First World War began in 1914. The US decided to stay neutral because of public opinion being against entry, as well as Wilson being against it. He wanted to stay neutral. But neutrality was very difficult because of pro-British feeling, anti-German feeling, unrestricted submarine warfare, and also unequal trade with the Allies. So the US did end up joining the war, and the main reasons for that are unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmerman telegram. The US joins the First World War in April 1917. And the League of Nations, the aim of that was to avoid further conflict. So instead of going straight to fighting, they would discuss their issues and sort it out like that through arbitration or sanctions. However, its effectiveness was limited because America never actually joined because Senate refused. So there was argument in the 1920s and 30s then that America should become more isolationist. Now, Congress felt heavily that America should remain isolationist, and there's obvious reasons for this. Things like a large number of people dying in the First World War, their experiences of the First World War, their failings and involvement of the peace discussions after World War I, the economic downturn that came as a result after World War I, but also this fear of the spread of communism, this Red Scare. They wanted to isolate themselves from the rest of the world. Now, most of the country did support isolationism. They lost a large number of people in a short period of time for something they felt like wasn't their problem. Okay. Now, figures like Roosevelt, who we'll see in the 1930s, does want an alliance with Britain. Wilson favoured collective security. But public opinion was definitely against getting involved with other countries. So when we're thinking about this next part now, I want you to think about arguments that suggest America was isolationist in the 1920s and 30s, and then arguments, well, actually, no, they're still interventionist. They're still getting involved with other countries. So Harding and Coolidge, presidents of the 1920s, felt like their role was more economic than political in terms of foreign policy. Okay, now the Fordney-McCumber tariff placed high tariffs on foreign goods. That then reduced international trade. So that is isolationist. That is isolating themselves from the rest of the world. They refused to join the League of Nations. They also introduced immigration quotas, which again isolated them from the rest of the world. So if you studied American 1910 to 29 at GCSE, those immigration acts that you've looked at are examples of isolationism in the 1920s. But they did still get involved with some foreign affairs. Now, they hosted the Naval Disarmament Conference in 1921. So although that's for peaceful reasons, they still got involved. From 1924, they started sending delegates to the League of Nations. So even though they weren't a part of it, they still wanted to be involved in this. They gave economic support to Germany with the Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929. So again, getting involved with Europe. They still had involvement with Asia. The 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact, when they signed an agreement with other countries to not go to war. Okay, even though it's peaceful, it is still not isolationist. Okay, they maintain open door policy in terms of trade with China. Like I've mentioned, the Washington Naval Conference of 1921. You could argue that an isolationist policy was never pursued in Latin America because there are a number of examples of intervention. So you've got occupying Haiti between 1915 and 34, occupying the Dominican Republic, sending forces into Nicaragua. Now, they're examples of America getting involved. It's clear that in terms of Latin America, there's no policy of isolationism. Now, in the 1930s, Congress were more explicit in this idea of staying isolationist. So they introduced a number of neutrality acts. Now, Roosevelt is now president. He wants to have better relationship with Britain. However, he knows public opinion and Congress were against this. Okay? They saw the tensions in Europe in the 1930s, so they wanted to avoid getting involved. So in 1935, they introduced the first Neutrality Act. It required the president to declare an arms embargo against all sides in a war and empowered him to warn American citizens to travel on ships of the warring countries. So they were not allowed to travel on these ships because look what happened with unrestricted submarine warfare, which caused tension. In the second Neutrality Act, it prohibited war loans and credits to any belligerent countries, any aggressors in terms of war. The Third Neutrality Act confirmed the earlier provision and made travel on belligerent ships unlawful, so they weren't actually allowed to do it anymore. Rather than just being advised, they were told not to. Now, like I said, Roosevelt wanted to play a bigger role. However, he had to support Congress in this because he knew public opinion and Congress was against intervention in European affairs. So at this time, Roosevelt also followed a good neighbor policy in the 1930s. The idea was that he would be a force for good in the Americas. So again, there's still involvement in Latin America. This idea about isolationism doesn't seem to apply to what is happening in the Americas. Also, with his quarantine speech in October 1937, you could argue that this was not isolationist, because he is clearly calling out countries such as Germany, Italy, and Japan. So he called for an international quarantine against the epidemic of world lawlessness. So he doesn't actually name them, but you can clearly identify these as the countries he's talking about. Now, he suggests use of economic pressure, but less direct than outright aggression. Now, those who wanted isolationism in America were angry about these comments, but these shows that Roosevelt is more inclined towards involvement with what's happening in Europe. Now, this is the last quiz now, and this covers 1890 to 1941. So that's the first unit done. I'll give you 2 minutes to think about these questions, and then we'll discuss them. Now, before I go through them, make sure you're considering what I mentioned about having a debate in your response. There's clearly some of these that you could argue for and against in terms of analysing and evaluating, okay? So not joining the League of Nations would be an argument that they were isolationist. However, sending delegates from 1924 is clearly an argument that they were still getting involved in foreign affairs. Okay, so that is that analysis, those different perspectives you need to consider. So give 3 examples of US isolationism. You could have mentioned the immigration laws of the 1920s. You could have mentioned not joining the League of Nations. You could have mentioned the Neutrality Act. 3 examples of US not isolating from foreign affairs. You can mention the Washington Naval Conference, Dawes and Young plans, Roosevelt's quarantine speech. So these are all examples of them not isolating from foreign affairs and their involvement in Latin America. So that's the key information I wanted to go through. I've also put a further task there which you could consider, and if there's anything you're unsure about with that, you can ask me at the Q&A in the live session. The next session that we look at is the impact of US involvement in the Second World War and the Cold War between 1941 to 75. In this, I'll start off where I've left it today, and we look at entry into the Second World War, American involvement in the Second World War, the Cold War and relations with Russia and China between 1945 to 72, and then the Vietnam War and its impact. Thank you for attending. I look forward to seeing you in the next session.